Hello learners, I am New Monica. After my last video on cyberpunk narrative involving really heavily the criminal sphere, I decided to take a look at the criminal sphere as it's described in Night City in Cyberpunk 2020. Night City has a gang culture that is carefully laid out and plays out really nothing like the gangs of the real world. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 is coming out, and this is of some significance because CD Projekt Red might be porting these gangs in directly. They might actually try to reconcile them with real-world gang activity, or do any number of things. So this is going to be a discussion of gangs as they exist in Cyberpunk 2020, a little bit about gangs in the real world, and a general discussion of how CD Projekt Red, various ways that they might actually be utilizing these gangs. Now, the gangs of Night City play out kind of like the gangs in the movie The Warriors. They kind of have turf, some of them have definite turf, but they're really defined by which member of the village people they most look like. Interestingly, they don't seem to have any direct means of income. They're not described as doing any kind of enterprise that would make them money. One could only come to the conclusion that there are members of the Steel Slaughter Slammers who are shelving stock at Walmart during the day. A number of them are just bizarre, and it doesn't seem like they would last for very long. They're generally classified by their behaviors rather than their specific activities. A gang normally would be defined by whether they deal in drugs, whether they deal in guns, whatever. These are identified more by their attitudes than anything else. As compared to ordinary gangs in the real world, one principal characteristic of actual gangs is that they, almost all, are identified by a specific ethnicity. Gangs tend to be ethnically defined. They're predominantly male. Some of them are exclusively male. Others may have female members, and their relative status compared to the male members really depends on the gang. And they are very much defined by their economic activities. What do they do to make money? A lot of this has to do with the fact that this is a full-on lifestyle. You are a member of a gang, and that is what you do and what you are. They are mutually supportive, they look out for each other, they don't walk away from each other. This is very distinct from most criminal syndicates where, in many cases, they're just trying to get out from under the poverty line. And once they do that, it's actually kind of expected that most of them will quit after a while. With gangs, that never happens. These are lifestyles. So now let's take a look at the individual types of gangs in Night City, how they are defined as opposed to the way gangs in the real world are defined. Chromatic metal gangs, or Kremer gangs, seem more like helter-skelter cults than actual gangs. They are defined by the style of chrome rock, which exists in Cyberpunk 2020, and apparently interpret the lyrics of chrome rock as instructions of some kind. This really plays out like a cult, which is interesting because there's a different group called cult gangs which really don't act like cults. It is certainly violent, but it isn't necessarily a gang per se. Most cults are trying to bilk their followers out of cash. These people seem to be spending all of their time doing chromatic metal helter-skelter things, so one wonders where the money's coming from. The next type of gang are combat gangs, identified in particular by the Metal Warriors in Night City. They are built on a kind of warrior code. In theory, you could say that they fight for honor, except they don't ever seem to be portrayed as having any kind of legitimate honor, which makes them much more of a belligerent form of fight club than any kind of actual warrior code or even really a gang. The only other noteworthy feature of them is that they are the only gang specifically noted for being mixed gender. The next type of gang are the cult gangs. these don't actually play out as cults. These are ideological zealots, certainly, but these aren't actually engaged in your typical cult activity. These are more like terrorists, ideological terrorists going out and fighting for a cause. And the textbook example in Night City are the Inquisitors, who are anti-cybernetics and will go out of their way to make life difficult for anybody who has any evident cybernetic augmentation. Again, this doesn't seem much like an actual gang. I mean, if a bunch of militant gun-wielding libertarians were to roll through town, they'd be called an extremist militia, not a cult, and not a gang. The next type of gang is actually legitimately a gang, to some extent, at least. These are called family gangs. These are essentially a small group of adults, or maybe a single adult, acting as Fagin from Oliver, bringing in kids, teaching them how to go on different kinds of criminal operations and sending them out to do things. Now, hiring kids is uncommon for gangs and not unheard of, and this is actually the kind of thing that would lead to a basic gang-type criminal syndicate. The example gang is really more of a poser gang than anything else, and we'll get to those. The next type of gang is also very much like an actual gang, and that is the hate gang. Hate gangs are identified by their racial supremacist attitudes, which many, many gangs bear to some degree or another. They're also identified as being entirely male, or almost entirely male. The example given in Cyberpunk 2020 is the Red Chrome Legion, or the Red Chromen. They are white supremacists. If you were to add an actual economic enterprise to the Red Chrome Legion, they'd function as a gang. They would be indistinguishable from a modern gang other than the advanced technology. The next type of gang is the party gang. The party gang are essentially fake nihilists. These are people that go around and screw shit up simply because it's fun and whatever. They are Clockwork Orange wannabes. These gangs are so mindlessly self-destructive that they really shouldn't have any form of staying power at all. In fact, a lot of GMs really ignore them because they do, to an extent, break the willing suspension of disbelief. And when encounters with gangs like the Piranhas do come up, they treat them more like a bunch of cyberpsychos or borderline cyberpsychos who are just barely capable of tolerating standing next to each other. And they don't have any greater support or any network or any real gang-like activity. And then we have the poser gangs. Poser gangs are such breaches to willing suspension of disbelief that most GMs really ignore them anyway. These gangs don't really have colors, but they have faces, biosculpted into being identical or under a common theme. The Night City example that comes up are the Kennedys. And yes, they are a gang that make themselves look like the Kennedys. JFK principally, but any member of the Kennedy family. And if you want a gang that looks more like something from the Warriors, you're not going to go much farther than this. The example family gang actually plays out the same way. They are the Brady Bunch. And yes, they make themselves look like members of the Brady Bunch. Really, I'm sorry, this just needs to go. The poser, I like Mike Pondsmith a lot, but he lays an egg every now and again, and this was one of those eggs. It should never have existed. The last type of gang is another one that just doesn't play like a gang. These are the self-defense gangs. These are groups of people who felt jeopardized, oftentimes by the acts of other gangs, and organize into self-defense. The example given are the Killigans, who are gay militants lashing out at homophobic groups, specifically and in particular the Red Chrome Legion. Now again, these aren't really gangs, these are militias. If they didn't take things too far, they might not even be criminals. These don't play out like gangs, and probably shouldn't be put into the same category. The Black Panthers, really, are a similar type, and it would really be worthwhile to classify these differently. Similar to the cult gangs, the so-called cult gangs, these just aren't the same type of animal. Now, an interesting side note is that one group, which isn't included as a type of gang, actually works like actual gangs, and these are the nomad packs. Nomads, which are an actual character type that you can play, which is probably part of the reason why they sorted them as not gangs, because gangs are bad and nomad packs apparently are not. But these are groups of people that have been essentially dispossessed by corporate America. And being generally blackballed, they organize together for support. Now, these are groups of families, which, already gives you at least a little bit of ethnic definition. But more importantly, they have actual economic activities. They are mutual defense. They have all of the qualities of a gang. And they were omitted probably because we're supposed to like them more, and possibly because some people don't realize that outlaw biker gangs are, in fact, actual gangs. So this leads to the $10 million question of the day. What is CD Projekt Red going to do with the gangs of Night City? Now, they might just retain them as is. It gives Night City kind of the feel of the Warriors, and that's good for some, that's bad for others, and some of those gangs are just really, really bad, and they don't work. And there's a general sense of willing suspension of disbelief that it doesn't necessarily break them, at least most of them don't necessarily break the willing suspension of disbelief, but it adds a bit of strain to them, which really doesn't work out very well when you've already got a number of things that you're kind of leaning on the willing suspension of disbelief to bring into the world. I would not be a fan of it if they decided to just ditch the gangs as they exist in Night City and shift to the real world. The gangs of Night City are part of what defines Night City, and there are a lot of good things to be found among them. I would actually rather prefer it if they were to do a sort of mix and match, adding classical gang characteristics to the gangs of Night City, and along the way removing poser gangs, because good God, they need to go. But adding economic enterprises to most of these gang types really does convert them into ordinary gangs. You might give more of the gangs an ethnic identity. If you go too far with this, you might as well just get rid of the hate gang category. Some of these might not actually demand that kind of definition. The family gangs and the self-defense gangs would really just be replacing ethnicity with a different concept. But in general, all you really need to do is to give them economic enterprise and describe them as a full-on lifestyle, and you're really good to go. And this is what I'm hoping that they end up doing with the gangs. It doesn't take much to make a number of these types feel like ordinary gangs. You might want to just recategorize a few of them. The Inquisitors and the Killigans don't really play like gangs at all, and it's really better to their identities to just completely recategorize them as militant groups rather than as criminal gangs. Which is not to say that these militant groups wouldn't be criminal, just to say that they're a different class of criminal. If they go about this, you would get a very excellent resulting mix with gangs that work the way one would expect gangs to work, but at the same time definitely feel like Cyberpunk and carry the tone of Cyberpunk 2020 very effectively. Just get rid of the poser gangs, dear God. But that's the general story of the gangs of Night City, and different ways that CD Projekt Red might be bringing them into the new world of 2077. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed it, or at least learned something from it.